Thank you very much. So I want to talk about, of course, these two papers, but also have some reflections of things that are important to all of us and things that apply to the broader regulatory landscape. And I would say that one thing that worked well, I had a similar role at this conference last year, as to several of you chimed in during this discussion. I think that's very helpful, so feel free to chime in, and Olivia, I'll still stick to the 15-minute target here. In my role in defining contribution, it's natural for me to focus most of my comments on individual investors, and also the impact on individual investors and how it affects consumers. So a couple of broad comments here first is regulation is trying to do a good thing. We're trying to do the best thing for individuals, for societies, for countries, and so forth. And when we get into some of the details, as many of us in the room do, it's often about the trade-offs. And Dave and Peter, you spoke a lot about these different trade-offs. And there are a couple of those trade-offs that I want to highlight. The first one is the almost systemic risk. The risks of, could be one age cohort having adverse effects, or maybe it's people in one particular country, having an adverse effect because of the regulatory environment. And the infrastructure paper does come to mind here in terms of, and David's comments on, well, we need to make sure that if we have, and I'll just illustrate this with an example. Let's say that we have a country, and I'll make it somewhat controversial. I'll say like a country like Argentina that has some risks associated with it. And then you invest in, maybe you have more of a nationalized or a pension plan, and then you invest in your own infrastructure projects. We need to make sure that we have the right governance structure in place to reduce some of the risks that some of the beneficiaries for that pension plan, that DB plan or so forth, have in these countries. So I think that is something to always look out for. And Olivia, I know that you feel strongly about these topics as well. The other point that I think is important, and it's on the DC framework, and it's something that came up a few times even this morning. Fran, we talked about this as well. It's about what's going on in different states today. And a number of different states in the US are trying to help investors start to participate in retirement savings plans. And that by itself is a wonderful thing. We need to get more people saving and start saving early in order for them to fund retirement. And as David, as you mentioned, it's really important. I think it's both for DB plans and DC plans that we have a kind of a higher hurdle. It takes more to safely retire. So getting people to start saving earlier and being part of the system is really important. That said, or I should just say that in addition, several of these states are then saying, okay, how can we provide further help and support for individual investors? Well, one way to do it is to also reduce market risk for investors. So let's say how we can apply some the minimizing the risk of significant shortfalls in the market. Well, by itself, that's a wonderful thing. But it's a little bit like, what's that game now, whack-a-mole, where you try to reduce one risk and then other risks pop up over here instead. And I think that's a good example of that type of game, where you try to reduce market risk, but then costs go up significantly, and the risk is that you don't meet your obligations in retirement. So that basically you're increasing longevity risk by reducing market risk in the portfolios. So it's important for all of us to think of what are some of these trade-offs. And Peter, you spoke a lot about the trade-offs here, and especially about, are we putting undue focus on one particular risk and then increasing another one inadvertently? Now I want to focus on a couple of specific comments on each of the two papers. So first, I'll start with on the infrastructure paper. Just hearing you, David, talk about infrastructure, I mean, it just sounds like a fantastic investment. I mean, here we have an investment that have strong risk-adjusted returns. You also have a structure of this asset that matches the liabilities, both of individual and and defined benefit plans. But we still see it's not as common as maybe it should. And one thing that you mentioned is just see the differences across different countries. It really speaks to the regulatory environment and the impact it has. From my own perspective, from a defined contribution perspective, I also think of complexity of including infrastructure projects. And in fact, I think of illiquid investments, of how to incorporate that. In many defined contribution plans around the world, it's almost an extreme liquidity that we demand. We're in a daily environment, daily trading, daily valuation, and so forth. And not only that, we need all that information right away. So extremely timely information is required as well. How do we include infrastructure and other illiquid investments? I mean, they can do a lot of good in the portfolios. They provide additional diversification. They can provide, I mean, there's some good research right now on the illiquidity premium as well. How can we incorporate these investments? In my view, I think one of the key ways to do it is to decouple the valuation frequency and the dealing frequency. So I think it's hard to, in today's environment, to move away from a daily valuation environment. The end user is looking for daily valuation and the ability to move money. They rarely do it, but they want that ability to move money, as needed. And plan sponsors and fiduciaries want that as well. But let's take an example here where an infrastructure investment is part of a default fund. And we know that default funds are kind of the fast-growing segment in defined contribution plans globally. So you have a 10% allocation to infrastructure in a let's say, a target date fund. Investor contributions and withdrawals, they can be handled and addressed elsewhere in the portfolio. But meaning that we don't need daily dealing on this infrastructure fund. But we do need daily valuations in order to value the entire portfolio. So we need to, from a regulatory standpoint, we need to find ways to make it easier to value in a fair and efficient and timely fashion, to value infrastructure investments, and for that matter, it can be private equity or unlisted real estate or other illiquid investments. And I think we should also consider other effects for fiduciaries. So I spoke to one plan sponsor recently, and they said that within their custom target date fund, they have a 1% investment in unlisted real estate. And she said, it is such a pain. It is so difficult. This has thrown away, all my reporting the timing of my reporting, the difficulty of my reporting is so challenging. And also my audit requirements are so different now because it's 1% allocation to unlisted real estate. It's not worth it, she said. So trying to, from a regulatory standpoint, make it easier for fiduciaries to include less liquid investments, I think is a good thing. So now I'm going to turn over to Peter and your paper. And I think the most interesting point, and I think you make it as well, is just, especially for individual investors, is looking at that transition from accumulation to distribution. How to address longevity risk for investors and the trade-offs here from a regulatory standpoint. This is incredibly important. I mean, this is the most important topic almost that we can try to address. And arguably, that transition has never been more important than it is today. So for example, in the US, 60% of DC assets in the US are held by participants that are 50 years of age or older. So you can see just how important it is for these investors to be able to get a secure retirement and a meaningful retirement, the type of retirement that they want to have. So back to David's comment about just the challenges that we face now from a return perspective, I want to illustrate that with an example. So think of an investor going through his or her career, investing in a well-diversified fund. It could be a targeted fund or a balanced fund and so forth. And I'm starting with using the capital return expectations, long-term capital return expectations that we at State Street had at the end of 2007. An 11% savings rate would lead to about a 65% income replacement. And that's consistent with the surveys that we have and others have, but what participants, what investors are looking for. Looking for somewhere between 65 and 80% income replacement. A very similar investor today, investing 11% throughout his or her career in today's environment, where we have much lower yields, much lower, significantly lower equity, long-term equity expectations, return expectations as well, and also greater longevity. The same investor would only have a 45% expected income replacement. So 65% in 2007 and 45% today. It's a 20% shortfall. Very significant impact. I mean, I call it a shock, really, to the system. So how are we addressing that? You know, how can we address that? Well, one way is to, and we already see some people doing this, they work longer. They retire later. So if we retire 2 years later, it means that on average you can increase your income replacement by roughly 5%. We're starting to close that gap. Similarly, if we try to have a higher expected return, you can start closing that gap. So if you have a 0.5% higher expected return throughout your career, and this could be through a combination of just, you know, maybe it's alpha in your portfolio, so it could be just taking on more risk, systemic risk that you expect to be compensated for, or it could be maybe it's including these illiquid investments and getting an illiquidity premium in the portfolios. But that leads to also about a 5% higher income replacement if you have a 0.5% higher return throughout your career in your portfolios. We're only partially closing that gap. The most important, the way to really close the gap is well-structured retirement income products. And just in a very simple example here, assume that you have a well-diversified portfolio all the way to age 80. And then you buy an annuity, an institutionally priced annuity at that point. That increases your I think, sustainable income replacement by, you know, it's something like a third. It's a meaningful improvement because of the pooling benefits of annuities and because you're insuring yourself against just great longevity. So again, we have a meaningful improvement that we are able to do as an industry. And the good news here is that from a regulatory standpoint, we're making progress. The guidance that came out in October was tremendous, you know, from the DOL and the Treasury in terms of removing several, in fact, the main hurdles in the industry for retirement income products in the US. And I know that elsewhere as well, we're making some significant progress. For example, having, you know, a lot of discussions going on right now in the UK, you know, kind of post-budget announcements in the UK. And I'm hoping that during lunch we'll hear a little bit more about the environment in the UK. So for example, we now know that we can incorporate annuities within targeted funds in the US. We can also eliminate, we're not as concerned about age discrimination testing, and also that we have kind of some structure in place to, as fiduciaries in the US to select or to enable investment managers to select insurance providers. But still, there's more work to be done. And I think, Peter, you mentioned this in terms of the almost unintended consequences you sometimes see with insurance providers. That if you're trying to do the right thing for consumers, but that may lead to insurance providers to limit the supply of annuities, or at least it becomes more costly. And maybe the capital requirements for insurance providers go up. So we want to make, I mean, I think it's given how important this topic is, and I know a number of us feel very passionate about it, you see I am, you know, try to pave the way, try to make it easier for the industry to move in the right direction when issues come up in order for ultimately investors to safely retire.
Hi, Fredrik. I'm Kevin from United Technologies. I wanted to ask a question about something I think you started saying early on about the savings rate while people are working. I think you talked about a number of about roughly 11%. Why do we as a group, and I'm not putting blame on any one particular element of the financial world, suggest that an individual who will no longer be able to produce their own income at some point in the future contribute at a lower rate than, say, a defined benefit plan sponsor who's typically contributing at double that rate, and they are doing that with the ability to meet shortfall in the future should it arise. Why are we doing that disservice and convincing people that they shouldn't save more?
I completely agree. I think that's an excellent point. And I also agree with, on average, DB plans, their actual contributions over time, they go up and down a little bit from one year to another. But on average, it tends to be contribution rates in the low 20s, for DB plans. So why do we settle with the average contribution rates? In the US is now 9%. So I felt that 11%, at least it was a little bit higher, but we should go much higher. I completely agree. And also it's interesting in the more survey work that we do that even though, and this is often a pushback that we get for this question, is that people are just so stretched, they cannot save more. Look, just it's a challenge for them. But what we find out is that investors, they do welcome steps to help them save more. So auto-enrollment, auto-escalation, all those steps are appreciated from investors.
Q&A, and so we'll spend about 15 minutes on that, and then we'll take a coffee break at 10:20. So why don't we continue with questions? If you have questions for David, Javier, or Peter, or Fredrik, please come up to the mic. Or maybe we could bring a mic to him.
That better.
There you go.
Question to Fredrik. David Vines from. Is that now better? Very good.
It's perfect.
And I'm David Vines from Oxford University in England. Early in your remarks, Fredrik, you talked about the determination to provide daily valuation. And I'm in a institution-provided plan, which, being an academic, I've been in the same career, move university, same career for 40 years. I have no interest in a yearly valuation, let alone a daily valuation. That is true of many employer-provided consumers. And to be stuck in an industry that insists on daily valuation takes away infrastructure opportunities, illiquidity premia, basically not just 100 basis points, but numbers much larger than that, per annum yield and pension opportunities. What's wrong?
Good question. So my remarks, I agree with you, and in a way that we have an undue focus on daily frequency. It's odd, right? That we have that we demand for these long-term investments that have a goal of 30-year, 40-year time horizon sometimes, that we then require a daily valuation and daily dealing frequency. That said, practically, both in the UK and in the US, we talk about what can we do, and what mountains do we push in order to affect change? I think that if we start having conversation about moving to an annual kind of valuation, I can just hear the difficulties in terms of well, what are we going to do with employer contributions? What are we going to do with a plan that's looking to make a change? What are we going to do with reporting? What are we going to, it's just become so difficult. So I think in a way that, to me, the pragmatic step here at least, and I agree with your vision, but the pragmatic step is to try to decouple valuation frequency and dealing frequency, to at least incorporate a portion of portfolios in some more illiquid investments to start getting those gains that you just mentioned.
You know, I'd love to comment on that too, because if you look back, 401k plans in the US started in 1981. Daily valuation really didn't start until 1991, so 10 years later. And it was almost an unintended consequence of some of the regulations. The argument was if you want to increase participation in your program, you need to offer more retail-like features such as daily valuation. People need to be able to see their funds in the paper, and then that started it. And I remember at the time I was working for a record keeper, and the record keeper said, "This isn't going to last. It doesn't make any sense." And here we are, so anyway.
Same loans also, I mean, the access that people have to loans and how easy it is. Also, does it really make sense?
Yeah.
But it's something that we can take steps towards it, but I think that some of those features are somewhat here to stay.
Yeah, and it's a question of how do you get it to change. Other questions? We'll go here and then there. Go ahead.
I'm Amy Kessler from Prudential of the United States, and Peter, I have a question for you. In your work, are you seeing a connection between the drive to low risk or zero risk in insurance companies, banks, and pension funds, and the low interest rate environment? And are we in a cycle that is going to be difficult to get out of?
So the low rate of return environment is a risk that is identified in many of the conversations we have with the insurers today. And it's becoming, I think, more pernicious over time as many, even sovereign rates have gone negative over longer time periods, over 1 year, 5 years, in some cases 10 years. The issue shows up in a couple of ways. One is the ability of insurance companies to earn a financial return obviously influences their cost structure and their ability to offer products that are, from a price perspective, attractive to consumers and companies. And so to the extent that they can't earn those returns in the marketplace, it raises their cost of product provision, and some of it's passed along to consumers. Secondly, the low rate of return environment motivates insurers and other investors to seek yield, to go longer duration, higher risk investments that will have slightly higher returns, but with significantly higher risks. And so there's a considerable concern around the creation of asset bubbles and the risk involved in reach for yield. Some of that's constrained by regulations. Some of it's constrained by capital markets through credit rating agencies and investors in the insurance companies themselves. But it is a huge pernicious issue that we've seen only grow in importance in discussions in the past 12 to 18 months.
We have a question here.
David Blitzstein. My role as both a public and private trustee, I've had great interest in infrastructure investing. And one thing that the paper didn't mention, I think beyond regulation, probably one of the greatest barriers to entry is fees and structure. A private equity structure with a 2 and 20 fee arrangement is a deal killer. And it doesn't really provide access to the infrastructure marketplace. Now, there's some interesting trends taking place where in-house infrastructure teams like Ontario Municipal Workers and Ontario Teachers and many of the superannuation funds in Australia are now seeking collaborators, like-minded investors, other pension plans, to work with them in co-investment or in side-by-side vehicles, where the fees are below 100 basis points. So yes, regulation can be a difficult issue, but in practical terms, fee structure and investment structure can be just as horrendous.
We have time for at least one more question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, certainly. I think that what you mentioned is important, that in our work we measure this specific point indirectly. What happened? The pension fund industry is a pension with scale. So we have one of the variables that we introduce in the model is the size of the pension funds related to the total size of the economy. So, and clearly, not only for infrastructures investment, but other kind of products, we see in market that have a low development in their pension industry. We observe a negative correlation between fees. Fees tends to be higher. And in the case of infrastructure, you have the additional aspect of the complexity of the vehicle, no? That makes also maybe, and this interacts also with the experience that you have in order to feel comfortable to manage this kind of product. So for sure, I think that is important, and we found indirectly an effect to the issue you mentioned.
Another question?
Hi, I'm Richard Che. I'm a benefits attorney in Washington, D.C. with Covington and Burling. It's maybe a different part of David's question, or coming a slightly different way. And I'm not an expert in this, but I think in the United States, infrastructure projects have largely been historically financed through the municipal bond market. And I was sort of curious about, whether you've thought about that, or is it's a situation, as David said, that the costs of financial intermediation there, take away a lot of the juice that pension plans might be able to get out of infrastructure investment. And also, probably the way the tax system is structured, because the municipal bond market enjoys tax preferences which are valuable to the individual investor, but pension funds generally don't need them. They already have their own setup, and that tends to reduce yield.
We don't know the case of United States in a detail, but in general terms, we have to take into account that each infrastructure needs their own project finance. And a project finance develop different plan of financing and other kind of strategic plans to develop the infrastructures in the long term. That means that we have to think about first of all what we are considering of infrastructure investment. So we consider is a direct investment or indirect investment in a listed or unlisted asset, and after that we have to make a good plan for each infrastructure one by one. In general terms, it's quite difficult to say what can we do for future in infrastructure investment in the United States, because we have to take into account one infrastructure one by one. And moreover, when infrastructure presents a lot of low returns to scale, because the first infrastructure investment made in the past has the higher returns, and the newest has the lower returns. So we need some risk mitigation tools to control the risk in this new infrastructure with lower returns to in order to see if it's convenient to pension funds to invest in this infrastructure. So we have to see case by case, by one, no in general terms in the case of the United States.
One last question.
Alan Rubenstein from the PPF in the UK, and it's more an observation, I'm afraid, than a question. Just to David Blitzstein's point, egregious fees certainly don't help. But even when you get to a structure where you have a more fund-friendly fee ratio, you still find, this is from personal experience, getting pension fund governance bodies to take the step into an area such as infrastructure, which they're unfamiliar with, is a very slow process. Risk aversion is extremely high, so no matter what you come up with in terms of the fit, the style of investment, it's going to take you time. I think that is probably one of the biggest problems. You know. Even, I think Javier mentioned Omar's, Borealis themselves, who have got years of experience, tried to raise a fund. They went round the world trying to find investors and they struggled. So I think a lot of the problem, frankly, lies with the funds themselves and their willingness to take it on.
Any reaction? All right, we'll go ahead and we'll take a coffee break. Let me thank our very distinguished panel, and then we'll come back after.